Welcome. My name is Fraser Robertson. I'm the owner and the founder of a company called Airt Audio. We're a UK distribution company handling international brands for the specific area of specialist audio. We have a number of brands under our portfolio, and we have very tight criteria about who we deal with and why. We have specific ideas about lowering the noise floor, making sure that we have products that blend well together, and essentially try to leave an acoustic-free fingerprint of the audio. So what seems to happen is we seem to find unusual companies, unusual brands who have almost a maverick style in their approach to new designs and ideas. We pride ourselves actually in finding these companies. They don't have to be big companies. They just have to be really, really focused and have a really, really similar approach to ourselves in how we get the sound into any space or any room. So with that in mind, I was looking for a new loudspeaker brand about 2 years ago. And it was really, really difficult to find anything that was grabbing us, getting our attention, really standing out from the crowd. So about a year ago, a very good colleague of mine, Justin Lewins, we worked together with one of our brands, Avalon, and he represents Avalon in the Far East for us. And he mentioned to me that at Munich 2023, he came across a fantastic company who made these incredible loudspeakers, and he thought I would be really, really interested and would be right up my street. So I did a bit of homework. I followed it through, and eventually at the end of last year, 2023, I decided to reach out and contact this new company. This new company is a Danish brand called OePhi. You may have or may not have heard of them before, but you're going to hear a lot about them. They're incredible products that are designed for timing is everything. And it sounds almost like a tagged on tagline, but it's not. It's exactly what the product is. It's all about the timing. It's all about being in the right time domain. What I didn't realize was that they also had a range of cables that in tandem with the loudspeakers need to work together to give you those results. So at the end of 2023, I reached out to Joakim from OePhi and arranged to go and see him. So January 2024, I took flight, went to Copenhagen, met the man himself, and this is where the story begins. I was inducted and almost programmed into the world of OePhi. My listening experience made me leave Denmark with a conviction that I was going to be representing this brand. Now, it's not the biggest company in the world. It's not the biggest brand in the world, but they do some incredibly special things that I think deserve to be heard by the world, but obviously with us in the UK. With that in mind, I've organized and invited for this presentation Joakim Juhl from OePhi to have an interview with us today. Thank you for taking all the time and trouble to get here. So what would be really interesting at this point is to understand a little bit more about the background, who you are, where you've come from. How did you get to this bizarre place of being in the audio industry and actually wanting to be involved in the audio industry? Was it a given choice? But more importantly, how did you get here? What led you to having a background that brought you into listening to music, playing music, affiliating it with, I know, your scientific background. So I'm sure our listeners and our viewers would love to kind of get a bit of knowledge about who you are. So
yeah. So I think that it somehow feels like it was meant to be now. But I think when I started back when I was 15 by making my own loudspeakers and so on, I think it was this kind of combination of being fascinated with both the gear, but also with diving into music. And I always wanted to I would say, create something. I had that kind of designer maker gene in my body. But I think what was really interesting was that in some ways, audio equipment was kind of tangible. So you could build a loudspeaker from materials you could get around the corner, and you could mess about with
physically
things.
make something.
Physically
yourself.
make something. So I think that there was something that was really approachable. But then there was also this, I think, fascination with the intrinsic problems of audio engineering and audio science, which is that we do know a lot of things about measurable things and things we can calculate, which use math and physics, which is kind of where I also come from. I have an engineering background before I went into science, but that those forms of knowing are just quite limited to actually understand what audio is about. So it's a bit like, how is it that how do you make fine wine or great food? Well, we can talk about the ingredients in the physical way, but there's a huge difference between that and then how things end up tasting, and how something becomes an experience that is really, really worthwhile.
Good analogy. Yeah.
And I think that is the fascination, that this kind of separation between what is known, what is objective knowledge, as some would say, as a problematic expression in itself, but then this kind of more subjective of how does music move us, what makes us tick, what makes it interesting, and so on. And that I think that distinction was really fascinating from the get-go, and it still is. And I still think that's also what is driving my way of approaching audio, is that it's not about fixing one particular problem. It's about understanding a class of problems and underlying nature of things in such a way that actually we can predict better the audible outcomes and so on.
So from 15 years old to now, with the greatest respect, is quite a few years.
Yeah. So
To date is obviously quite a long time to gestate making a company from it. So there must have been a lot in the interim that you did, or you worked with other manufacturers, or did you work for other things and your own designs, or?
So I've probably been designing and making about 70 loudspeakers, if not more. So I think I probably designed more than most professionals. but the whole idea was that the way I went about it when I was younger was that it was not about making money. It was about like having an excuse to make something new and interesting. So I could use people who needed new speakers to also kind of negotiate with them like what they needed and what we can do. And then I could test out new ideas about how to design those speakers and what kind of drivers and configurations and crossover designs and so on to go into that. So it meant that if you build 70 loudspeakers, you would probably need like a really big building to just contain those. So it was always about...
Let me just say this. You would be the ideal friend. I would have been friends with you when you were younger, without a doubt. You know, Joakim, can you make me this? Can you do it in this way? Can we make it sound like that? Well, you'd be annoyed.
I think for me it was really a way of being creative, but also to learn new things, so that I could, in a semi-professional way, do things at a very, very small scale, but also maximize my ability to learn from what I was doing. And I think for me, I did have a dream about starting a company and going professional from very early on. However, I also had other things that I tried out. So I became an engineer by training at the Technical University of Denmark, and then when I got kind of enlisted to do a PhD. So I thought, well, why not? Let's try that. And then I actually got a job offer from Harvard, so I went there, worked for a couple of years. But all along that, I just could.
Can we just pause there a second?
Yeah, sorry.
Harvard.
Yeah,
you just skipped over that really, really quickly.
Yeah,
people don't just go to Harvard. You know,
no, I was employed there, so I was kind of brought to Harvard as part of my academic trajectory. And I think it's interesting that I think that the world is about finding these venues where you can really find people who understand what you're doing, but also test your thinking and so on. And I just think that for me, it has always been about going as far as I can, and not necessarily about doing the things that most other people will get, but rather doing the things that I feel is a worthy challenge to pursue. And I think that goes into how I go about doing.
So you're not
scientific
interested
work.
in an easy life then?
No. If it's easy, it's a bit boring. I also drive Alfa Romeos, so like if you wanted it easy,
let's not go down that track. Been there, done that.
Yeah. But I think in a way I just couldn't stop messing about with audio, and then my sweet wife, she told me after COVID hit the world that, why don't you just do it?
Yeah.
And by then I had a lot of concepts, I had a lot of things that were pretty kind of almost there. And I said, well, yeah, I think this is it. So I kind of focused on the last part of 2020 to kind of get some things actually shaped up into products and to go for a professional review to actually get the name OePhi and the whole business.
In reality, the company's not actually been going that long.
No.
And when you look at the accolades and the support from press and prominent people in the industry, you're building up quite a bit of momentum, which is really impressive. Which is the thing that impressed me when obviously I experienced your products myself. So it's almost not by choice. It's like me wanting to work with you. It wasn't. I didn't choose to do that. I had to. It was a case of no. This is the right thing to do. So yeah, it's a worthy pursuit. So.
Thanks. Well, and I really appreciate that you're bringing me here, and also that you are representing our products in the UK. I think that for me, the critical part is always that you have to find your audience, and I think you can either hunt down whatever you think the audience is, or you can do the things you really believe in, and then you have to wait for the right people to show up and to get it. And for that, I'm really grateful that you you just got it from the get-go. And I had the same, I would say, experience every time I sent something for review, or every time somebody new is listening to my stuff. I don't anticipate that people will necessarily get it or like it or anything. So for me, it's always from zero expectation to whatever they get out of it. And it has been, I would say, it has been really interesting to also see how much positive feedback we have gotten, because I know that we are not doing anything in any similar way to others. So in that sense, that my expectations of how this would actually commercially be able to develop was not particularly high. It was more like an experiment. I would say that what if you don't do things just to kind of think in a commercial way about, okay, let's make this sound a bit easier to listen to, a little bit easier to work with different systems and so on. But like, what we do is kind of the opposite, to say, okay, how do we solve the right problems in the best possible way? And tell the truth, because that's what my experience was, especially when I first listened to the speakers, was it's like there's a lack of a sonic fingerprint. Yeah.
It really feels authentic and really genuine when you play a different recording, when you play a different piece of music. There is no correlation between one piece of music and another, or one type of recording and another, which I guess I can understand why you would say that there'd be an apprehension possibly about the reception, because actually you've got favored recordings that most listeners or viewers of this will have, that they'll have been used to it sounding a certain way. And actually, when you take away the veil, you might not be listening to it in quite the same way. It doesn't mean the music's not, the same music, but there's no candy coating of it.
Yeah.
There's no coloration of going, oh, this is how it sounds, and we're going to do a slightly better version of it. And that's been my experience of listening to some of the music that I've listened to for the last 30, 40 years, is playing them and going, wow, it's like really, truly like fresh. And I know a number of reviewers have picked up on the same thing. So I can understand your nervousness, but I think there should be a confidence that what you're really delivering is something that is commercially, cost effectively. It's almost like the product is, and we've had this conversation on the phone before, it's almost like it's too good
Yeah.
So you're almost looking at something and going, it's a £4,000 or £5,000 pair of loudspeakers, but actually it should be 3 times, 4 times the price. So therefore, the association of where they are. In fact, actually, even beyond that, to be fair, because they're doing so many things so well and so right. The only limitation is your expectations on, frankly, the rest of the equipment you're plugging it in with. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's the fundamental, I would say, pursuit has always been about how do we go back to the most original version of the music, which of course is a kind of a philosophical problem in the sense that how would we know unless you actually have been in the studio?
Exactly.
But I would say from a pragmatic point of view, there are ways to work about that, and that, as you said, that if recordings kind of, if you pick up these subtle differences and they are abundantly clear, and you don't get sort of like a tendency across different recordings, then you can kind of in some ways use that as it's a relational thing where there is not one kind of reference point and then you can just correlate everything to that. But it's a relational thing where the more you discover, the more you realize that it's less and less about the imprint of the speaker or the cable, and more about like what is actually the content, the information that is coming from the recording studio.
One of my intrinsic questions is cables first, speakers first. It's almost the chicken and egg scenario. Which came first? Was it the cables that, from a design point of view, the bandwidths and the almost the invisibility electrically and signal wise of the cable that came first in that sense, or was it actually I need a pair of loudspeakers that tell the truth and that can be honest, which is dangerous because obviously it tells you everything about everything else that's in the chain. Which kind of came first?
Yeah, so back when I started, it was mainly about the speakers, and I had like a very mediocre like system back then. So I had like an NAD receiver and a CD player, and I kind of wore both of them down in 2 years by using it that much. So it got me started, and I think what I quite soon realized was that when you voice a speaker, when you work with kind of getting everything to work together, you become dependent on the quality of the signal feeding those speakers. So I quickly started to look into what if I had back then it was CD player. So if I had I moved to an Arkham CD player, so a few steps up, but still kind of like mid tier. But I was also like, maybe I was like 15, 16 when I got that. So it was like, for me, was of course expensive back then. But I think for me, like in order to do speakers better, I had to sort out a lot of other things, because the better I became at making loudspeakers, the more the amplifier, the more the source, the more the cables matter. So it's been, I think, a learning curve that has been moving in a lot of different domains at the same time. And I would say probably just had this idea of, well, you can buy certain things, but you cannot buy the expertise or the knowledge. That's a different kind of investment. And I was much more drawn by experimenting and not necessarily doing it because I knew I needed a product to sell something, but just to figure out what can I do.
It's a learning.
My own appreciation.
It's almost like a learning process.
Exactly.
I mean, that's one of the things that you've said in the past when we've had conversations, is that you often would rather eschew and get rid of the idea of exotic materials, exotica, for the sake of it, to get the fundamentals right. Because if you get the fundamentals right, then the addition of the exotica, then, whether it's silver or copper or gold or whatever materials it is that's in the chain, well, it only then has value if it actually has value. Not just for the sake of, which is sometimes is a case in the industry, in many industries, is that we often just put great value on, it's made of silver, and it's the highest percentage copper that you can get, and blah 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 blah. But actually, your relationship with it is actually, no, those things are things to be potentially added to, using your analogy earlier on, of like a recipe. Cooking a dish, well, the better the ingredients, yes, it can make it better, but actually you need to get the infrastructure and the understanding right first to know what you're adding as the seasoning.
Yeah, so I guess most of us would prefer to have a meal prepared by a top chef with mediocre ingredients as opposed to a really bad chef with the most expensive ingredients that in the end you can't compensate for a poor design or design limitations through the material.
Yeah.
So the material does matter, yes, but there are a lot of things you should attend to before you turn to exotic materials. And it just so happens that copper is a good conductor, so it's not particularly expensive. Obviously, if you want like certain purities, it might become more expensive. But it's just to say from a very pragmatic standpoint, if you just kind of get the basics of the material, then it's much more about how you use them.
Yeah.
And that was I would say the realization that also made me start with cables first, was that
so cables, so did
commercially
cables, so loudspeakers kind of were at the core in the beginning when you were young, but actually it was cables that really got you on the track for the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah. So commercially, I started as a cable manufacturer. I've been making speakers and amps and all sorts of stuff, like just because I could not do that.
I've been in your studio.
Yeah.
I've seen all of your creations. There's lots of them,
and there's even more than you have seen. So, but anyway, but the thing was that for me to enter the commercial market, it was not because it was a necessity to kind of, this is a way of making a lot of money, anything like that. It was more a question of what is it that is not there that I think the market deserves. And from an engineering and science perspective, I needed to come up with something which was not just another take on the same old problems, but a radically new take on problems that very few people probably have understood or even kind of like actually experienced or really kind of like looked at before. So I would say that in my early kind of cable experiments, I quite quickly realized that, well, when you configure conductors this and that way, then you have these cable parameters and they kind of co-configure one another. So you can kind of mess about with that, and you can mess about a little bit with conductor size and dielectric material and so on. But you're kind of pretty much tied into certain configurations that then this is how...
Same old.
Well, you can look up any physics book, and this is how they will tell you how these parameters correlate. So if you move the conductors closer together, you will get more capacitive coupling, and then that will actually seem like you're taking down some of the self-inductance, but it's actually just because you're shorting out something. So it's not really changing the fundamental properties of the conductor, but it's how these things come together.
So you've kind of more looked at it from a holistic point of view of looking at all of the parameters, all of the characteristics to try and make the cable the least intrusive.
Yeah, and the trick was to say, well, so this is how it normally works, but what have we not done? And how can we figure out something that can displace these configurations in ways so that it opens up new areas of performance that has not yet been understood?
Yeah.
So obviously our cables do work kind of under the same physical laws that any other cables. But the way that we design them and the way that we have come about optimizing them are following some principles that are quite different in such a way that the conductors are not behaving as you normally expect them to. And it's about maximizing the utility of the material in such a way that we also can I would say control the ways in which that signal propagates through the conductors, so that we don't have kind of damping issues or resonances, but also that we don't have, you can say, ways in which that dynamically you have changes in the way that the current actually goes through the conductors, which also means that all of these cable models that we normally work with are steady state models, meaning that this is how it is under a DC circumstance or with a sinus sinus signal. So however, what happens if we change the load, if we change the frequency, if we change the dynamics and so on, all of that matters. And we kind of know that if we look into other domains of physics and engineering. It's just that in the cable domain, somehow it has been this very narrow focus on certain things. And then we've kind of just been spinning around the same kind of ideas and the same problems.
Well, I mentioned that. Sorry to interrupt, but I mentioned that at the beginning about you kind of, in a way, your philosophy. And I mentioned timing is everything.
Yeah.
Every cable that you open, every box of the loudspeakers you open, you have a card on it, and it's very much your kind of your solid branding in a way. Is that timing is everything.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing that relates to cables, and obviously in retrospect, then obviously the loudspeakers as well. So timing is everything is quite a bold statement, and many would possibly question that. But my understanding of what you're saying is that actually you've looked at the wider parameters and things out with the norm to actually really investigate how to propagate the signal. And that cable.
What I've learned from appreciating UK equipment is like the timing of the music, sort of like the pace and the rhythm and so on. So
not quite sure which brand you're talking about now, but I
do have an LP12 or two. So there is that kind of school where I think that you couldn't release a product unless it conveyed music. Then maybe some of the technicalities of the reproduction were not always as much in the focus, but the timing, the way that music kind of came together, and that it was an experience that interesting and was about conveying the message of the music. And I think so that's one interpretation which I very much adhere to. But there's another interpretation which is kind of the underlying. So why is it that? How is it that two amplifiers can measure completely identically, and then one times fantastically and another is just presenting sound, but there's kind of no cohesion, like no musicality going on? So what's going on? It's not the distortion, it's not the bandwidth, it's not the power. Actually, oftentimes it's the opposite.
I was about to say it's the very thing that often things get measured by, and has been something over the last 20, 30 years. And it's probably, as I said at the beginning of this interview, I deal with quite a few maverick companies who kind of eschewed the kind of typical technical measuring thing. And it's not that measurements, as you've pointed out, it's not that measurements don't mean anything, but there's a much bigger thing at play here. There's other questions that you need to ask, which is measurements are only a little bit of the equation. It's understanding actually, well, how is it that we get that sense of musical communication engagement over just noise?
And I think it's one of the greatest misunderstandings of science is that science is not just measurements, it's interpretation of measurements. That's the whole key. And I think this is something that you can easily lose sight of if you have become an engineer who's been trained by the book, and then you kind of see the world through the book. But I think that's kind of not satisfying, especially when we have to recognize that what that book has to offer only offers part explanations, but not, let's say, what makes music interesting and so on. So what I discovered by going into the cable kind of really exploring parameters of cable, so I figured out ways to experiment with taking apart parameters, kind of configuring cables so it didn't follow these fundamental things. So what does the self-inductance do? What does the capacitance do? How if I move about with the capacitance according to the length of the cable and so on? All of these things were things that I found practical ways to experiment and to listen and to figure out how does that correlate to listening impressions. And what I discovered at some point was that if you do the normal things to increase bandwidth, at least according to theory, you end up with actually getting the result that seems opposite. So let's say you do something where cable A is supposed to have 1 bandwidth, cable B is supposed to have twice that or maybe 4 times that, but then cable B sounds slower and it sounds thicker and it sounds less detailed and so on. So what's going on? So what I figured out was that the way to control this was that I needed to ensure that the propagation of the signal going through the cable was not skewered. It was not kind of smeared.
Yeah.
So it came down to figure out...
Hence timing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it came down to actually looking at that very, very minuscule differences, timing differences in the wavefront, but also when the signal would stop, you can say that you have both kind of, when a signal comes, you have kind of like, what is the dynamics, the peak, but then you also have the valley, you have the silence.
Yeah.
And both of these depend on not only the bandwidth, but also the timing performance, so that you don't have a smearing. Because if you increase bandwidth, but you don't get a better timing performance, you might get more information, but there's not more structure, there's not more order to it. So oftentimes you actually get more out of less if you can kind of keep the coherence of the signal. But in our case, the idea was to say, if we know how to control this, we can just keep on increasing bandwidth and we can still control the timing perfectly. And what we discovered was that when we did that, we took the sound out of the cable, because all of a sudden there was nothing in the signal transmission that made something odd, that somehow tricked something in our hearing apparatus, our cognitive way of making sense of these signals in a way that could kind of tell us that something artificial was going on. We kind of found a way to actually almost remove that to a point where it's really difficult to hear that.
So cables, obviously, cables have always been and should be considered as filters.
Yeah.
Because essentially that's what they do. So I'm guessing what you're saying, and it's been my experience, is that actually, if you take that out of the equation, well, you're no longer going, this cable's really good for mid-range and it's got a brilliant extension at the top, but you're not got enough bass. But actually, if you get cable B, you need a bit more weight. And so often a dealer or a customer system may need this propagation of that quality to try and balance it up, because it's almost like you're EQing the hi-fi system to get the end result that the customer wants. So I guess that's where your kind of nervous anticipation of how people would pick up your cables and your speakers would be, because when you tell the truth, sometimes you don't like to hear what you get, but actually understanding why you're getting that result, which is part of the reason for doing this interview, is to kind of go, don't blame the messenger, you know, and there is a scientific reason why it's been done this way. However, you need to understand that as a journey. You know.
And that's the key, is that when we achieve to remove the sound imprint of each product, it also means that whatever you experience when you put in that has more to do with what it replaces and the rest of the system. And we just decided from the get-go that, well, our purpose is not to make pleasing products that try to target whatever people might want on that particular day, but rather we want to offer proper engineered solutions that actually take away problems that otherwise you have to fight with one way or another.
But introducing those into the general marketplace, which obviously we're going to find out ourselves. We've had a really positive experience with most of our dealers, to be brutally honest with you. Most really get it. But obviously, when you start to do that, that is not a commercial product. That is a product that is kind of in a way, for me, which is why I fell in love. You're right. And when we first met and I first had an experience of your products, that was my first experience. Was okay, this is going to be interesting in the big bad world. But actually, it's almost like we need it. It's almost like we need the shake up of actually what is it we're listening to. And everyone has an opinion and has a value of what they like sonically. But to have a product that, I'm not saying has zero acoustic fingerprint, because
it's not possible.
It's not possible, but attaining the highest kind of getting out of the way it's a noble And I have to say, with experience in the products, it's a very noble thing to experience. And sometimes you have to immerse yourself for a little while in it, as I did with some of your products. And then you really, really get it. A bit like your power cable.
Yeah.
I mean, your power cable, you'd always said, it's like, well, really, power cables, it should be.
Yeah.
And power cables have always been a big thing for me. But when I tried the Imminence, I just kind of sat back down and went, okay, that's redrawn the lines of what I thought a power cable was supposed to do or not do. So, yeah.
And that I think is really the trick is that we don't want to make products that just kind of does whatever you expect, but we want to make products that on the one hand work as kind of lab equipment, like it's just made for being utterly precise in ways that you're normally not, like you don't see in the market. It's not about price, it's about the physics and the engineering behind it. Yeah. But then on the other hand, it's also about, I think, putting people on a journey. Like there is things to be learned and relearned, even though that you have a lot of experience. Then what we have found out, the ways that we have found out to kind of manipulate with the ways in which electricity behaves in cable, actually pushes some boundaries in ways that you rediscover both equipment you already kind of knew, but maybe you didn't know it that way, but also the music and so on. And I think that for me is like, OePhi is about learning. It will never stand still. We will always, if we find some new way of doing something even better, we will do that. Because it's not about just putting something out there, then that's it. But it's a movement. And I think it's about also offering something to the industry that I think it forgot that it was all about, which hi-fi basically means that it's about creating a rather truthful representation of the music, but somehow it got sidetracked into all sorts of different ways of maintaining certain properties but not others, and then all these different schools.
And manipulating it because the trend is to make it a certain way or a certain...
And by all means, I love the different flavors of different kitchens and also in hi-fi, but what we try to do is to say, can we offer something that offer you the purest, cleanest sense of that? So if you have, let's say you just love this tube amp, well, we should not tell you how to love it. We just want to make something that conveys the exact qualities of that in as little modulated and manipulated way so that you can actually fully appreciate that. And that means that if you roll tubes, you will just be able to hear even more clearly what these different tubes are doing, because we're trying to not kind of water down or modify or recolor or something that whatever that amplifier is doing.
So in essence, going back to the original kind of question, cables really came first. So,
as a commercial,
in a commercial sense.
Yeah.
So therefore, the loudspeakers in a way, was that through a frustration of what you're plugging the cables into, or was it just simply a natural evolution? Because loudspeakers, which is why at the beginning of the interview I said I've really, really struggled to find a loudspeaker that would meet my expectations of excitement and expecting something of, the performance of my first range of loudspeakers, or in our company's range of loudspeakers that we really follow. You're looking at, your entry point's £20,000, and below that, I've really struggled to find, something that has that inspiration of music and life and communication, etc. So what you've achieved with your loudspeakers for me is outrageous. When you look at an Ascendance 2.5, I mean, a loudspeaker at that price point, it's doing things that loudspeakers just do not do for 2 or 3 times the price easily. So it's really, really great that, the cables came first, but the loudspeakers had to become the voice to be able to tell you what the cables were doing. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think you can say like that. I think that a very practical consideration bringing about cables to dealers and to shows is that you realize that when you do something like we do, which is to make products that don't have an obvious imprint on the sound. It just comes to matter much more about the other equipment.
Yeah.
And I don't mind that. It's just that somehow it's as if by we really focusing on doing honest products, we just end up being the least obvious products in the room, because we're the only ones who are actually, fundamentally transparent in ways that we just don't see.
It's the classic thing that's happened over the years at shows. And with being in this for 20, 30 years, I've seen it so many times. You'll have 4 customers walk into a room at a show in particular, and one will go, "Oh yes, it's that CD player. Oh yeah, I love that brand CD. Oh, that's what's making this sound fantastic. I love what it's doing."
Yeah.
And then you'll have another client walk in and go, "Oh, those loudspeakers, I love them." Or the next one will be, "It's the cables." Everyone ends up with an opinion about
whatever they focus on.
Yeah. So I can understand that the cables could kind of get lost in the mix, because everybody's going, "Wow, those speakers are amazing." But actually, if you were to take the cables or the signal path out of it, they may not feel the same way.
So obviously we are very proud when we have been able to elevate systems in ways that they can overperform compared to the price setting, which is of course why we think our products are also worth it to have, because they're not taking away things to achieve what they do. They're just they're actually not taking away things, so it's not about
and they're not adding
exactly. Because in a cable you cannot add, you can only take away. So basically, if you get more bass out of the cable, you can ask.
You heard it here first.
So what did they take away to get more bass? And that's the conversation I have also had with other professionals in the business, where they just kind of like, tell me where with Ohm's law that this cable is giving you more bass. And they can't, because it's just not the way it works. Actually, if you want to have more bass, you would have like a thinner cable, because then you will have less control over the speakers and so on. But then people think thicker cable, more bass, and then, well, maybe the thicker cable is just slower. So that's why you're getting this impression of more punch and blah, blah, blah.
It is one of the things that when you pick up your cables, it was my first impression, you pick your cables up and to be fair, some of them do look quite big and chunky, and then you pick them up and it's like,
they weigh nothing.
Okay.
Less mass, less to go wrong.
It's like expensive air. It's expensive.
Very expensive air. So I think that to be fair, we have had a lot of really good shows with good partnering equipment. So it's not because I had like a big problem with any of them.
No.
It's just to say that at the end, for our cables to become kind of more in their own right, we also needed something in the system that was made from the same, you can say from the same way of thinking. And
so it all goes back to the whole philosophy thing.
It goes back,
and then that's something that I wanted to kind of touch on, which is, you have a very strong philosophy, and it permeates through the cables, and it permeates into the loudspeakers, and it's like listening to your loudspeakers. And as I say, my guys that are on the road and myself have experienced it myself with the Eminence 2s recently. With your cables on the end of them, I've rarely heard bandwidth and the ability to play music the way that they do. It's kind of unheard of. If you turned around and told me that these were £40,000 pair of stand mounts, I'd go, okay, I believe you, because you just don't hear this kind of bandwidth and this kind of cohesive in the room. It's there. It's being played for you, rather than it being like, oh, here's a coutured sound that kind of has a lovely mid-range and blah, 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 blah. They don't do that.
They just do what you put into them. And I think that is the exact same thinking as the cables. It's just that obviously when you do a loudspeaker, you have some other kind of things to consider in the design and how to make it work. So I would say voicing a loudspeaker is obviously a different scenario than voicing a cable. However, you still have to do it, and you still have to understand like what's the trade-offs. So a lot of people say, oh, we want more bass, but then again, how is it that you kind of get that? And then the way I have come to look about it is that there is a way of doing it where you go for something that is as close to neutral and natural as possible. And that's going to have the least amount of compromises, both in technical terms, but also in timing and musicality, because you can't have anything that is pronounced or taken back without losing something. Yeah. So you kind of have to work around this idea of having a loudspeaker that is also trying to make the least imprint by itself, just basically being what it's supposed to be is an electroacoustic transducer. So you put an electrical signal and then it converts that as much as it can into acoustic output. And then obviously in loudspeakers, we're talking about quite low, you can say, efficiencies and so on. So it's not there is no perfect technology here, but you have to balance out these things in such a way that you get the feeling of completely open window into the music in the same way as the cables are doing it. And it's the same fundamental thinking. So the timing is absolutely critical here.
Exactly. I mean, that's what I was going to say. That it's the timing that comes up in reviews actually quite a lot.
Yeah.
In a number of the reviews that have certainly been done here in the UK and in other places. And I have to say, it's so. I've never been a huge ribbon fan.
No.
There's fantastic qualities to them and they can do some great things, etc. in a certain presentation. I've never heard a ribbon that this has got more dynamics, it's got more headroom, and it never runs out of steam. It just keeps on going. It's extended, dynamic, fast. Whereas that's not the normal expectation of ribbons, and then they eventually kind of let go and they become whatever, and they sound real and present when you play something live. And that's something that actually I'm trying to inspire my guys to do, is to use a number of recordings, because when you play live music, it's one of my favorite things. With your cables on your loudspeakers, you play live music. It's live.
Yeah.
It's not. It's uninterrupted. It really sounds live, and that is it's kind of unheard of. Certainly for me, certainly in this type of loudspeaker, and it's actually not even a loudspeaker thing. It's a performance thing.
Yeah,
it's a pure performance thing. It's almost like forget about what's in the box.
Yeah,
just listen to what the end result is.
Yeah, and that's probably the best advice you can give to also any consumer of hi-fi, is that don't think you understand what went into the design. You might have been reading about this and that, but it's about the execution. And there's no way other than the designer that actually you know exactly what went into that. So I agree with you. I guess
that's especially with the. I mean, you are a very, very early adopter of using the Purify in the case.
Yeah.
But there are many loudspeakers use the Purify drive units, and I haven't personally heard a single one yet that does what you have been able to achieve with these. So yeah, I mean, it's not, again, that goes back to the materials don't make the product. You know, if it's got to be allied to the right understanding, the right application, and the right presentation.
Exactly. So like picking out drivers here, we have the Purify woofers and we have this ribbon, and the whole point is that the drivers are just tools. So it's about how you use them, whether or not like whatever end result you want to achieve, but also of course limitations of what you can do technically with making a loudspeaker. And my yardstick is always, you cannot improve on the driver. So you can't take a driver with a lot of problems and then believe that you can do all sorts of wicked stuff with the crossover, and then all of a sudden all of those problems are gone, and left you have something perfect.
Yeah.
That's not how it works. What you can do is you can take away stuff, and you can have a crossover that can do a lot of things that is going to mess up the time domain. That's going to be very audible, and it might take away the attention from how the driver actually sounds, but it's not going to improve on it. It's just going to interlay additional layers of artifice to the sound that is being conveyed. So the first thing I do with drivers is that I listen to them. I just take them out and I put them on the table and I put a signal on them and I listen to the driver. Like it's that basic.
We were talking about this very thing on the way here about actually not listening to a drive unit in a box, but actually just literally sit it in free air. And that's almost like
so
a starting
obviously
point.
this is not how it will sound in a box, and the box shape and all that will matter. But there are certain properties where it just doesn't lie, because you have to get a sense of what's coming from the driver, and then you have to keep that in mind when you're then doing the complete speaker. How is it that you can get something that is as close to the best properties of that raw driver without anything? Because that's the fundamental noise floor. That's the fundamental kind of what is the kind of the least amount of distortion or modulation or whatever of the signal coming through the driver. And adding crossover components, adding a box and so on is going to condition that, but it's not going to in some magical way remove, for instance, something called like the iron distortion that just comes from the noise of having current running through the motor.
You've just then touched on something that I've been championing for a number of years now, which is lowering the noise floor.
Yeah.
And it's that very fundamental thing that actually is, for me, has been my experience in the last many years. Is that actually by whether it's acoustics or whatever it is, when you lower the noise, what's actually already there will come through and it will shine. And it will either shine really, really well, or it will shine not so well. But again, you've got to get rid of that noise floor. You've got to lower it. However, you've got to get to the truth.
Yeah.
Again, it's that balance of people. Do they want to hear the truth, or and all of the benefits that come with that, but you need to understand that you need to do some adjusting in other areas to get the balance of both, which is what you're just talking about with the cables and the speakers.
Yeah,
so
it's all about about the noise is that the time kind of dimension of the noise is extremely important, because that's also how we can better understand how is it that we can measure a speaker and then measure the harmonic distortion, which means that you have like a fundamental and then you have sort of like harmonics being added to that, which of course you want at least of that as possible. But that's a steady state way of measuring a speaker. What happens with the energy that is actually stored in the moving parts of the driver, in the crossover components, in the cables and all of that. And all of that adds to a time domain distortion, which then you also have to figure out. So we have chosen the purifiers for various technical reasons, but fundamentally because it was the first driver I actually heard where I was thinking, okay, in all accounts, all over, it's just really sorting out all of the fundamental problems in a way that I have not yet heard from any other manufacturer. And the point is that we can choose the driver we want to work with, and then we just have to find a way to make a viable product so we can offer performance to people that is not priced up in a way that it doesn't need to, but actually just offering like what is the best version of this technology in such a way that like also people who are not super rich can actually get access to something.
I was going to say, I mean, that's one of your other fundamental qualities that I really love, is that this is all about attaining something and reaching a point that actually gives you performance and all of the things that you would normally associate with things that are far, far, far more expensive. And I've always loved that approach from yourself, which is that, well, just because the products come out at this price, it's about achieving a goal. It's not about achieving a price and, just adding another zero on the end for the sake of it. It's actually about this has been designed right. This is to achieve those fundamentals.
That's the moral obligation of the designer. That is to maximize. It
comes down to morals.
Absolutely maximize the performance for any given product, for every given, you could say, material input, and not just saying, well, this is what people expect, so we can just do it like that. and then that's fine, because like there's a lot of that in the market, and that's fine, and people can choose and pick various different versions of whatever sound that designers have intended. But we feel that what is really interesting is to say, what if we actually make products where, even though they're not cheap, but actually for what you get, you get something which can measure up with the most expensive, well-designed stuff out there, but where we have been extremely price conscious about every step in the design process and the manufacturing in such a way that we can actually squeeze as much performance out of any product at any price point. And the easiest thing in the world is to make things more expensive. Also coming back to exotic materials, like it's not difficult to buy something expensive and make something more expensive. That's the easiest thing in the world. The difficult part is to how you kind of keep a certain control over the costs, but still you maximize the performance so that...
I mean, we're not vilifying you're not vilifying, and we're not vilifying or denigrating the use of exotic materials.
No.
Far from
They have
it.
their purpose.
They have their place and their purpose, but it's just that your approach and your basis is fundamentally, if you don't sort out the basics and the physics and the understanding of how you get from there to this, then it doesn't matter how much you throw monetarily wise or material wise at it, well, it still doesn't fix that problem.
Yeah, one of the really challenging objectives that I had before doing development, and that goes for both speakers but also cables, was to bring together two camps in audio. So as I mentioned before, that there is a camp that kind of turns around UK manufacturers, where timing and the energy in the music and all of that is kind of very front and central. And then maybe sometimes the technical aspects might not be kind of put front and center in the same way as then maybe you can say some American manufacturers might have a quite different focus on, let's say, big soundstage, but they don't convey rhythm in the same way as, let's say, the smallest name amplifier would, for instance.
Exactly.
And I think what for me was a problem was that these two camps are kind of thought of as you have to choose. Either you go for one and you give up on the other, or you don't get it at all, or vice versa. And for me, that was like, what's the technical reason behind that? Is it just a cultural thing, or is there something there that where we can actually also push some boundaries? So one of the things I really wanted to do was to make cables and speakers that actually are kind of at a very elite level in both of these realms, without having one compromising the other. So I think that was something that is believed to be almost impossible to actually achieve.
It's almost like they're diametrically opposed, and that the two things can't live in the same space.
And that's where the timing come in, because what I discovered was that it was the same parameter I had to control and optimize for that actually would give both. So the micro timing that I'm talking about in terms of how we design the conductors, how we not only voice the speakers, but how we actually only do the voicing on the condition that we have absolute perfect time coherency between the drivers. Those kinds of things actually meant that it's both solving these technical attributes of the reproduction, but it's also making the perfect fundament for the musical timing, the energy of the music, and these things to actually fall into place. So it's not either or.
It's not. I was going to say it's not one or the other. It's actually you can have both, but it isn't a choice. You just have to handle it and deal with it in the way you've described.
And the expectations of the market would probably be that you have to choose. But I would say come and listen, because from everything that we are picking up on and we're getting a feedback is that we actually did nail this in a way that I believe very few others, if any, actually could do. And I had a tester in Denmark who did a lot of testing in our early stage, and he said to me at the end, well, you did the impossible. You brought these things together. You can't do that. Like, it's not possible.
You heard it here first. The impossible has been achieved.
But I think it's about how we think about what is it that we try to solve. So we don't try to solve these as parts in and by themselves in discrete ways where we are not looking at the others, but we're trying to find that fundamental factor, that fundamental mechanism that is actually responsible for as many of the attributes that we're then listening to. So we're not treating the symptoms, but we're trying to find root causes and then understand how they operate, how we can engineer solutions around optimizing them, what we're optimizing for, and then we can implement that in designs.
Wow. Okay. In a way, it's drawing from many of the disciplines that you, through your different scientific life and through your academic life, you apply a hub of a problem, but instead of just going, there's the empirical, there's the logical, there's the philosophical, you build and pull from all different sources to reach a goal. So instead of it being a linear, oh, it has to be this way or it has to be that way, you actually bring in all of those things into a design process. And that's very open. That's very open and very unique. And it's not controlled and contrived. It's actually the opposite. It actually gives you the freedom to actually go, you know what, I'm going to make this work.
Yeah. And I think the big challenge, which I think is, of course, also a very personal thing, is that in order to get there, it means that you have to be willing to look for the vantage point from which these things actually do line up.
Yeah.
So the old kind of ways of thinking can be useful in some ways, but they can also be counterproductive if they prevent a view where you can actually see these things as not being opposites, but actually lining up in the same axis, basically. And that's also what I think is really the deeper purpose of OePhi. Besides, of course, making a living out of making something I love, a deeper passion is that I think that this is also a way to shake up in the industry, to think about that it's not about you have to choose one or the other. It's about there is a way where we can actually do things fundamentally different, and I would say in many ways sufficiently better. And then
don't be restricted by the bounds of your knowledge and your experience in one area. Open that up.
Yeah.
Explore and go beyond to actually see beyond the problem to find out where the source may lie, rather than just going, oh, well, that can't be the answer because that law says that you can't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as you said earlier, the kind of convention of putting systems together and then using cables as that kind of glue between the stuff, but also trying to sort out maybe things that doesn't really line up well.
Yeah.
I would say, why not do the opposite? Choose cables and speakers in such a way that you can actually hear exactly what's going on. So then you can also put electronics together in ways that is actually making the sound that you love. And then don't let anything get between that and your appreciation of it, but just choose things that actually let you get to that. And I think this is what we're trying to offer as an alternative to the, okay, use this and that cable, but rather, why not use the cables as a tool that tells you what's going on? And then you can make much more informed decisions. And the same with the speakers, basically.
So it follows in suit from what we were talking about earlier. The cables kind of, in a way, came first as the road into the OePhi journey, but the reality is that the speakers then definitely came second. But actually, it's all about the communication of the entire message. They're speaking the same language, and they're telling you everything upstream. Obviously, my automatic reaction to that is, I've experienced it. It's great, but it does make me kind of think, okay, so when's the OePhi amplifier coming? When's the OePhi DAC coming in? But the reality is that what I think you've tackled probably the most influential links, in the chain. So cables have been a domain that have writ large controversy regarding, belief in them, non-belief in them, technical beliefs in them, voodoo, etc., etc. And loudspeakers have always been the voice of the hi-fi. They've never not been anything else, but they are the transducer that moves the air, that puts the music in the room. They are the exact opposite of a microphone, but doing it for moving air to actually recreate that event that's been recorded. So you've actually, in a way, tackled probably the two fundamental.
And the trick is that the ways in which I've found to look at these by looking at timing and figuring out ways to control timing means that that's something that can be interpreted into the different domains. So what is it that needs to then be sorted in the speaker? What needs to be sorted in the cable?
Yeah.
It's the same fundamental thinking. It's just that there are different problem areas that you then can design from a different vantage point. So instead of taking a speaker and say, okay, how can we sort of like voice this to create a balance of the acoustic power into the room, then we can start by saying, how do we ensure that the acoustic power is all lined up, first of all, so that after that we can look at the balance, but not just that we are looking at putting out this amount of energy from the treble or the woofer, but that we want this energy to be absolutely synchronized, because otherwise we are just not solving the most fundamental problem, and then we're just patching up symptoms rather than actually going to the root cause.
It is. It's just like a smudging and a smearing, and that continues to. That problem hasn't gone away.
Yeah.
You've just exacerbated it, but changed it and moved it to somewhere else in the frequency.
And once you then solve these things, you end up with something where, unless you do it like where the speaker is actually kind of more or less neutral, natural, and linear in terms of how you listen to it, like in terms of in the in-room response, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
It just has to match up. There is no way of saying, oh, take away a little bit of that or add a little bit of this. It's just like, it's so apparent what is going on because it's a manipulation that just stands independently of all the, you can say, artifacts in the time domain, distortion, and so on. So you kind of peel the onion, take away these skins, and then actually what becomes evident and clear seems to make more and more sense.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, I think we've probably covered most of and almost all of the points that I think we both wanted to get across. I think it's keen to say that anyone that is interested and really would like to experience an OePhi product, we're in the process of building the network right now in the UK. There are a number of dealers. I would urge anyone to resculpt your thinking and to consider a different approach and get your ears around some OePhi products. So thank you very much, and I appreciate you coming. And
thank you, Fraser.
We'll see you soon. Thank you.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.